Welcome to the Futurist Society podcast, where we delve into the latest advancements in technology, science, and culture. From discussions on the latest breakthroughs in AI, biotechnology, and space exploration, the Futurist Society is your window into all of the awesomeness that the future holds. Get ready to be informed and inspired as we consider the positive impact of emerging technologies on humanity. Without further ado, welcome your host, Dr. Awesome.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Futurist Society, where we are broadcasting from the present and talking about the future. Today, I have Michael Cushman, who is a futurist and an expert in many things. But today, we're going to be talking about food and how it's going to be changing in the next coming years. So, Michael, thank you so much for having us. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in this area?
Well, you don't grow up thinking I'm going to be a futurist. That's not something your guidance counselor is going to tell you. But I was very lucky. My father was a long-term planner for AT&T. So he was thinking 10, 20, 30 years out for AT&T and trying to plan out where technologies were going, such, at that time it was satellites and, cable, fiber cable and things like that. And then how would they build out infrastructure for AT&T? So he had degrees in physics and electrical engineering. And so as a kid, we were pulled into every World's Fair. So I went to the 64 World's Fair and the Expo in Montreal, et cetera, which was fabulous. As a kid, didn't really appreciate it probably as much as I should have. And we were close to Bell Labs. So he took me to Bell Labs when I was a kid to see the first transistor, the first integrated circuits, things like that. I never thought of myself as a futurist, though, until I was a consultant doing a lot of big business transformations. And one of my colleagues said that on a previous project, what they had done is looked at the future of this particular industry to kick off these projects. And I thought, boy, that's a brilliant idea. So this was back in, in the 90s. And so from then on, I did all my big consulting projects with a start with where's the future going of this industry? What kind of technologies are going to change? To really get people excited and motivated to change instead of forcing change on people. Once you spend some time saying this is where things are going, everybody gets juiced up about imagining their jobs changing and the company changing. And so that became my MO of that. And then I had a friend who had a friend, and he said, hey, you think a lot alike. You need to meet this guy. And that's Thomas Fry, the head of DaVinci Institute. So that was 20 plus years ago. And we just had coffee and realized that my background and thinking and the way I did stuff matched very well. And I brought a different skill set. So Tom's a really out there thinker. He does have his PhD was in user interfaces and things like that at Bell and at IBM. But he just thinks really, really broad, not necessarily practical. I had a much more practical background in MBA and a science background, and I always was working with businesses and bottom line. So, I've done a little bit more of the bigger consulting projects that we have. So, someone comes in and says, I won't use a company name, but a large company comes in and says, we're building this technology, and how is this going to change our workers' life? How is this going to change our customer base, et cetera? So that's my basic background. Now, as far as food, I am not a food expert per se. I'm a technology expert and how technology changes things, the way we work and live. But I've found that every presentation that I do, I introduce some ideas about food because everyone eats. No matter what the person's background in the audience, but they find it very interesting to talk a little bit about the future of food. And so it's a great grab inside my presentations because not everyone wants to talk about some specific industry thing, or get deep down in the weeds about some technology. But when you start talking about food, everyone's interested about food.
Yeah, I really was excited to talk to you because I do think that we are becoming more cognizant of what we eat as a species. I think that when I was growing up, there weren't as many healthy options as are now. And I think that people understand the connection between the food that they eat and their health much more so than ever in the past. So much of our existence as a species was just subsistence eating, right? Like we weren't even able to live in a feasting kind of state that we are right now. And now we've been eating so much that it's actually causing us to have negative problems. And so now we have to kind of scale everything back and really focus on food. Where do you see us going in the way that we're eating? Because I know that a lot of people are talking about, the health aspect of food, but the technological aspect, when we think about how computers have changed the way that we operate, what is coming down the pipeline in food technology that's going to change our society?
Yeah, there's so much. It's a really broad topic. It's interesting. Pollution, it's interesting because pollution and even global warming, all these things are related to farming as well. So you can't completely separate one thing from another. I'll give you an example. If we were just to continue our current farm practices and we add over the next 50 years, 2 billion more people on the planet, we would need farming to use all the usable land in the world and all the usable fresh water in the world.
Yeah.
So obviously that's not a sustainable model. So what's good is we have technology to enable us to change, and we have a reason to change. You need pain to really get behavioral changes. So there's different ways of looking at, say, agriculture or farming. I like to talk about it as the future of food because you don't necessarily have to have agriculture to have food. Now we're moving into a phase where we can generate food without growing food on a piece of land, for example, like we do. So and I liked how you mentioned that it used to be subsistence living. I think just the future, how we got here from agriculture, to me, the invention of agriculture is the most, or discovery of it is the most important thing in human history. It changed us, but it took a long time to change from when we first simultaneously around the world, around say 12,000, 11,000 years ago, discovered this idea that, these things are seeds, and if we throw them somewhere, there'll be more of them. And once that started to happen, human beings could stay longer and longer in one place with one food source. It's the very first technology that scaled. And I like to think of as a futurist of what scales, and that changes how we work and live. So you scale the land because now you can have more food on the same amount of land. And now we start to stay there longer and longer and we need people to actually do the farming. So by the time it takes a long time. There's not really significant innovations. There's just a slow transition going on from gatherers and hunters, and we're simultaneously planting things. And then we begin to domesticate stuff. The plow took 6,000 years to invent after the discovery.
Wow.
That's how slow. The wheel is in that category of 5,000 years later. The written language is in the category. It took a while for this to begin to change who we are and what we do. But then once we settle, now we have culture. Now we have to have rules. Now we have more people. We have to have hierarchies. We have to have specialization of labor. Everything we know today is based on this concept of living together in one place and passing on knowledge and information from generation to generation until we are here today. And then, we had to, so scale matters to me. The only other, just a quick one, I think the other key scale was the printing press, movable type. So now we could spread information. Instead of one person copying one book at a time, we could make thousands. And the next one is the Industrial Revolution that we all think about, where we add power to our tools. So, for example, we first did coal, and we did steam, and then we did gas, and then we did electric motors. And so then we were able to make things at scale. So that's the next huge scale. And that's when the life started to change. 1790, we begin on this path of incredible production of things, right? And the computers come in 1950. Now, it's telecommunications, it's digitalization, the digital scale, right? I mean, you make one copy of something and now the next billion copies are all free and instant. Yeah. So that's where the next scale comes from. And now we're entering a new phase, which I think was going to add to the food story, is AI. So the AI with generative AI, we've really now going to scale intelligence and thinking and prediction and design. So That's the next piece, and that's very important. I'll give you an example in food. So from 1950 until 22, we were working on understanding proteins, and we had to do it the old-fashioned way in a lab and play with them and try to get the structure and function of a protein. And we got to 100,000 at a cost of $7.5 billion to get to understand those 100,000 proteins. We fed that information into an AI in 22, and it told us the remaining 1.9 million proteins, what their structure and function was instantly. So for free, basically, we got 20 times more information. That's how AI is affecting. Now, obviously people think of protein as food, but if you think of protein, what it really is, it's molecular robots. And these molecular robots, of course, digest our food for us that we eat, but it also creates every aspect of living things, right? So every bacteria, fungi, insect, animal on the planet uses proteins to make itself, to maintain itself, to grow, develop. Every part of our bodies are built by proteins. Proteins are the primary signaling system inside our bodies, and proteins are our immune system. So, proteins take our food, turn it into us. And the profoundness of being able to understand 2 million proteins that exist in nature and what they do, it's a huge leap in science that the average person's not going to know about. Yeah. But it changes everything.
Right. So I agree with you. I remember before the advent of this understanding of proteins, to find out a protein structure was a very complicated process. It involved a whole host of steps. It probably took weeks at a time. And now it's so much easier, which I think is a big leap forward. The reason why I would just want to focus on protein for a second is because I think that we think of protein as meat and meat as protein. Yep. When it comes to food. When we're talking about meat, which is something that I feel like is part of the human diet for most people, how far away are we from producing that at scale like you're talking about, without having to slaughter a cow, without having to hurt an animal?
We've started to scale. So there's companies in the United States, UK, Netherlands, Singapore, and originally started in Israel to grow meat, right? So cultivated meat, it starts in a lab, and then you put it in a bioreactor and you grow it. And so what it's done, once you took stem cells from a cow or any other animal you want, you grow it and direct it. So we have this ability now to take stem cells and direct their growth pattern. So we can grow them into proteins, we can grow them into fats. And of course, we've been playing with this from the point of view of creating the right texture and taste and doing that. So that's been the kind of the development commercialization side. But we're starting to commercialize in those countries that I mentioned. And the regulatory bodies in those countries are making the space for that to be considered real food and available. And it is real food. I mean, it is a cow or it is a chicken or whatever. What I like to tell my audience is you can eat anything in the future. Because there's no slaughtering. If you wanted to eat kangaroo, you can eat kangaroo. You want to eat anything. If you like the combination and the taste, you can do it. And this also enables customization of the food. So you can decide what other nutrients could be built into the food, right? And what tastes built into the food. You could even put medications into the food if it made sense to do such a thing, right? If a person's on meds, they could just be eating and not have to think about taking a separate pill. But the commercialization is happening. One of the Israeli companies has opened a big bioreactor in Atlanta, which I think was a good choice because they don't really have much cows. So they're focusing on cows. The guys in California focusing on chicken kind of surprised me because just the price of beef is higher, per pound. Obviously, you can go the high scale, think of the most expensive beef, Kobe beef, and it definitely is commercially a good choice to make money at.
So let's say, like, is there any way, like, are we there yet where somebody can go somewhere and get human created, non-slaughtered beef and eat it?
I know here in Denver you can. You can go.
Oh, really?
Interesting. Restaurant that serves it.
Wow. And so, like, how much does that go? How much does that go for?
Expensive. I think a hamburger is like $10 or $15 or something. It's a little on the expensive side, but it doesn't have to be, though. I mean,
right.
If you looked at the price, over time, the first hamburger I think cost well over $100,000 to make. So I think a couple $100,000. What's also impressive is how fast it is. So farming is terrible from the point of view of the feedback loop is very slow. So if you want to grow, you say, the price of beef is high. I'm going to start having more cows and I'm going to get in this business, right? Well, it should 2 or 3 years with growth hormones, by the way, to get the cow to the point where you can slaughter it.
Right.
Growing a hamburger or something like that, we're talking 6 weeks max, probably the equivalent of. So we're able to grow the food fairly quickly. And I can talk about another technology that's even faster. So we're going to see there's even going to be a battle in how that market is built. So the other technology I'll just talk about briefly is newer, and that is to take carbon dioxide plus sunlight. So essentially we're starting to imitate plants, create a meal for bacteria. The bacteria produces the amino acids for us. So then when you combine different kinds of amino acids, you get the different flavors of meats and taste and all of that.
Right.
So this doesn't, and this scales very well as also. And it's pretty cheap to do, sunlight and carbon dioxide right out of the air, feeding it to these microbes and have the microbes produce,
interesting,
using their own internal proteins to produce these amino acids. And this can be done anywhere, just like the other biofuel. You don't need to be in a land that normally can produce food. So
I mean, I think that if we can't replicate meat that humans consume right now, it's going to be very difficult for people to adopt it. Like, I know that other alternative protein sources like insects and honestly even tofu, like, it just hasn't caught on mainstream. And it's so deep in our cultural consciousness that I want to have a steak. And if we can make an artificial steak that tastes like the real thing, that's when, like, the quick adoption happens. And quick adoption is what is really going to spur change. Like, if human beings can't get on board with this kind of stuff, then we're really just doing, we're doing it for no real gain. I think that I would love to live in a future where this stuff is available, but if human beings aren't going to adopt it, then it's just not going to happen.
Right. The people who are commercializing get that. They're on it. I saw a really cool piece of technology. I think it was at MIT, of course, something I'm playing with. But what it did I thought was cool, was it printed, they used a 3D printer to print out the chicken cells and simultaneously used a laser to cook the chicken as it was printing. And even scarred change the laser so it scars it, looks like it came off of a grill. And it tastes like it came off of a grill.
Wow.
Isn't that cool?
Interesting. That is so cool. Yeah. I want to try it now. Like, now that we're talking about it. So there's a restaurant in Denver, you said, that serves?
Yeah, there is. And I'm sure every major city or cool city or whatever, I'm sure San Francisco would one. I think Boston would probably find someone.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, there's going to be resistance, which I think is always fascinating, right? Because the existing industry, of course, is scared to death of this, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, one of the states out here out west, Montana or something, or Nebraska, they actually passed a law that says meat has to have a hoof or a cloth to be called meat.
Yeah.
That won't last. But it's fun to watch also the normal resistance that humans have. And that's an industry resistance, not what you're talking about, which is the consumption. And when I talk to audiences, I go back 2 years and I started talking about the cultivated meats and growing meats. Almost everybody would gasp in the audience. The idea of taking stem cells and growing meat, and then that's a real hamburger. They were like grown and, I can't imagine. And now I just gave a presentation 2 weeks ago, and only one person grown. That's just, and the idea somehow is getting out there anyway.
Yeah.
And so I don't think the adoption is going to be as hard as people. And when you start talking about the slaughtering of animals, that to current system, what cows do to our environment currently is disastrous, really, right? So it's not sustainable. A hamburger takes 600 gallons of water to make when you count the crops that are involved and the animals. Then animals, of course, pollute the water with E. coli, for example. We have this problem here in Colorado. Always the farm runoff is running off E. coli into our swimming areas. And so the beaches are closed right now in the major swimming areas that are lakes because of E. coli. Then you have phosphorus and nitrates. And this, I'm going to share something with you that to me is really scary, is that farms they're addicted, just like cocaine, to using phosphorus and nitrates because they've destroyed all the topsoil.
Absolutely.
And that's a farming practice that could be changed. Not one way of getting a better outcome from farms, but it's become addictive. And of course, the industries want you to stay addicted, right? Keep buying my nitrate, keep on. And then the land has been destroyed from the topsoil point of view, so it doesn't absorb water well. So when it rains, it just washes off these chemicals. Now, they go into streams and streams into lakes. Now, at first, this is not a bad thing because bacteria will eat it. But what's happened is we've reached a tipping point, and too much nitrate in the water combines with the oxygen in the water and sucks out the oxygen at the bottom of lakes. Without oxygen, the bacteria can't eat what's at the bottom of the lakes, all that sediment, which is then producing the equivalent of postbiotics downstream. So all the nutrients that all the fish and all the insects and all the other living things and plankton, whatever it is, downstream need that bacteria upstream to be producing those digestive nutrients, right? And so we've created dead zones in the bottom of our lakes. And this is brand new science. It's scary science because we have dead zones in the ocean. Now we're having dead zones in our fresh water. So we need to stop polluting with nitrates and phosphates in our farming. So there's another reason why we need to move to different alternative cows and meats. And I like meats and I want to taste it and I have no problem with it. Because to me, it's like, stem cell, you grow, it's the same thing. Exactly the same thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I always think about this. I was telling you earlier, I live just a stone's throw from MIT. And when I'm at dinner parties, oftentimes we're talking about futurism and things like that. And I always ask the people that I'm with as an intellectual exercise, what in the future do you think that we're going to look back at and just be disappointed in ourselves? The same way that we look at like war or, we're just like, not a good time for humanity. And I always bring up the slaughtering of meat because I think that, just the way we treat animals in general, like, for example, when you're talking about, dolphins or whales at SeaWorld, for a long time, everybody was like totally fine with it. I remember going to these places and being so amazed by all these tricks they could do. And it's only now after, we realize like how difficult this is for the dolphins or the whales that there's like this backlash and people are just kind of not comfortable with it anymore. And I think that that's something that's good. The same thing is going to happen with large mammals and other animals that we slaughter on a regular basis, because, it is a practice that we do and everybody's comfortable with, but just a few seconds thought into it. If there's another option that gives us that same amount of nutrition, that makes sure that, it's safe and good for your family, I think that most people would take that. It's why the veganism movement has become so popular in the past few decades. Have you tried it? Have you had the meat at all?
Not. So
no? Okay.
I'm talking out of my butt. I don't know.
Yeah.
But, from what I've talked to people who have had it here in Denver, and they say it's fine.
Yeah.
I can't. I know there was I just read an article in AP. So there you go. There's the acceptance level of it, and it was just an ordinary beat reporter who went and tasted some chicken that was from this California group.
Right.
And he thought it was fabulous. He was very skeptical, of course, but once he had it, he's like, wow, this is chicken.
Yeah. No, I'm interested to try it. Honestly, I didn't know it was in production yet. I've I thought it was always like this thing that was out there as a technology that has not actually gotten down to someone like myself, but I'm interested to try it. Let me ask you a question in regards to these places that are serving it. Where are they getting it from? Like, are they making it themselves, or is like there a company that makes the stuff?
I don't think so, because I mean, it's still the technology is still proprietary to some extent. Anyone probably can come up with it once you understand how it's done. But at this point, the scaling is the trick, I think. And so you need the right, bio reactors to grow it at scale. And so you still have to ship it from wherever those places are. As I say, Israel was the first to really do it from the lab point of view. And they realized you think about Israel, you're not going to grow a lot of cows in Israel, right?
Yeah.
It's always necessity is the mother of invention, so it's always someone who's kind of has a good reason to make something or do something that's different. Let's talk about Netherlands at some point, because the Netherlands is the second largest exporter of food in the world, and they're doing it completely differently than anybody else is. And it's really interesting to talk about them.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? Honestly, I never thought about that with the Netherlands being like, what are they doing differently?
Well, of course, one of their advantages is that they're flat, so it makes it easy for them, but they're not doing it outside. They're building all of these huge greenhouses that use vertical farming. So So when they grow tomatoes, and they're doing it with hydroponics and just water, for example, and nutrients in the water as opposed to using soil in some of these vegetables. And for example, and they've been able to just incredibly produce more food by just using science. So in Spain, I think is the number one producer of tomatoes, I think, in Europe. And in Netherlands, they're able to produce 80 tomatoes for every 4 tomatoes in the same space that they do in Spain, because they're doing it vertically, and they use 1/4 of the water. So Netherlands isn't, so they produce all kinds of vegetables, carrots, blah, 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 and they're exporting that all out to Europe. And it all kind of just came together for them. They just, as a country, the right scientists came together, the farming industry came together, the academics all came together and said, let's this be our industry. We have this advantage of everything being flat, so we can build all these greenhouses inexpensively. We have the scientists to play with this. So what they've done, and what they're actually moving up the chain already, they're already the number 2 exporter of food in the world, but they're moving up into the intellectual side of this. What is cutting edge, and what technologies can we build in robotics? Because they use more and more robotics to test the soil, to do the, making sure when to harvest and do the harvesting, whatever. So they're trying to eliminate the human beings. I'll give you an example of some of the stuff they're playing with. They have this tiny, tiny little drone that can detect moths. So moths are hard to normally eliminate without pesticides. And they don't want to use any pesticide and any herbicide. It can spot a moth. It attacks the moth and just chops it up with its propellers.
Wow.
Playing with all kinds of crazy, cool stuff in order to get rid of herbicides, get rid of pesticides.
Yeah. So let's talk about resources for a second, because there was recently an article that came out in the press about how vertical farming specifically has an issue with like the amount of resources that are required to make this stuff. I agree with you. I think it's the future. I mean, when you think about the difference between 2-dimensional versus 3-dimensional, it just makes sense to grow up. But a lot of, specifically the US companies, have gone under because they're doing it with like artificial light. And I think the greenhouses is not something that I've heard about. So have you heard about the same thing in regards to the resource issue?
Yeah, we can talk about the light, because, for example, what they're doing in Netherlands is playing with what different frequencies of wavelengths of light affect the growth cycle and how and what time of day you should. So they're still using artificial light as well as regular light in their situation, because they found that certain light waves stimulate more growth.
Mm-hmm.
The other things, I mean, there's also the genetic side. So there is a push to genetically re-engineer plants to grow faster. So they're pretty inefficient when it comes to photosynthesis. So we've been able to double the rate of photosynthesis inside plants with genetic engineering. And so now the seed population around the world is slowly moving in that direction. The US companies have failed, you're right. They kind of jumped in a little too ambitious, like, oh, robots are going to do everything and we're going to have all this. And they didn't care about the cost too much and just assumed they'll be able to scale faster. And I think the way Netherlands is doing it is a little more pragmatic, right? They're actually growing stuff and actually selling it at a market price by increasing the yield and then having labs play with new ideas, economical to introduce over time.
Yeah. I mean, I think people are skeptical about genetic engineering when it comes to their plants, but I recently tried a strawberry made from a New Jersey company. It wasn't specifically genetic engineering, but it was selective breeding, which is honestly kind of the same thing. And the fact of the matter is, this strawberry was more sweet than any other strawberry that I've ever had in my life. And it's very expensive. It's like a pack of 4 to 8 for, $30. I think it goes up to $60. But the fact of the matter is it was like eating candy. It was so delicious, more delicious than anything that I've ever had naturally. And so I think that that's something that's going to be exciting also. Not only is it going to be nutritious, but it's also going to taste better. And that's when I think that the mass adoption is going to happen with this kind of stuff, because people will pay a premium to have something that's more tasty. It's why, high-end restaurants do so well. And we just have to have a better product from that community, I think, before these things starts happening. One of the quotes that I always love to say is that, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones, right? And if we're going to have anything happen, it has to be better than what currently exists.
Sure.
And honestly, I can tell you that this strawberry is better than anything that I've ever had, so I'm excited to see what's coming on down the pipeline. I just worry when I hear those kinds of things that it's not feasible because of the amount of cost and things like that. So it's nice to hear about the Netherlands. Have you tried any of these yourself? Have you tried any of these not genetically, but hydroponically grown strawberries or anything else?
Community here, so not strawberries, but we had, for some reason, hydroponics with fish on the bottom and plants on the top. Started in Denver about 20 years ago. We had a whole community. We had a dead zone industrial area that had what do you use it for kind of thing.
Right.
Near old railroad tracks and things like that. And they went in there and they just started doing that. And they've been still there. So in Denver, we do have on one of the streets in the art district, there's a 3-story former warehouse that is a vertical farm, and they put glass on the front so you can see it when you're walking down the street. You can see all the farms growing.
That's awesome.
And they grow. This is where it's economical. They grow the kinds of spices that are expensive for restaurants. And we have another restaurant that uses cargo containers, old ones. And it's doing vertical farming in there because it's kind of field, right? And you can just control the light. And they're doing the same thing. They're growing expensive herbs that would be sold to restaurants. So they use it themselves. And so they're picking it that day and, right there. Because there is a system in a market most people don't realize around freshness for these high-end restaurants. But people have been growing them maybe near the city and then have a distribution system on demand to get to wherever those restaurants are. But this is sort of replacing that a little bit with vertical farming, growing them closer to the restaurants and inside cities, and using things that are just sitting there or wasted space or whatever.
Yeah, I do look forward to the day when the amount of time that you pick something to the amount of time that you eat something is like non-existent, right? And I've had that personally. I tried out this indoor hydroponic system called Garden, Gardyn. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but honestly, the vegetables were so delicious And I was like a dinosaur. I would just walk over, grab a piece of lettuce, and I would just chew it while I'm like watching TV or something like that. And they made tomatoes, they made eggplants, all sorts of different things. The amount of biomass that it created for a family of three, I have me, my wife, and my young daughter. It was more than we could sustain. And so I ended up like, trying to give it away. And it was amazing how just this small, it was probably 5 feet by 3 feet. The amount of stuff that came out of it is just the upkeep, like if for me as a professional, like I just didn't have the time to clean it out and do all that stuff. But I do look forward to that day when we could have our own garden inside our own house and, be able to eat stuff directly the way that nature intended.
A little local, I was just say a little local thing is the gentleman who invented the first commercial for the average citizen is here in Denver. His name is Michael Cushman. And he created the very first one, and he went on the Home Shopping Network and whatever and sold those things everywhere and eventually sold his company off. So he was the first person to introduce that idea of growing it right in your own home.
Wow.
So I said, we just had this history here. This has been a kind of a hot spot for that way of thinking and doing.
Yeah.
But I'll say something about the freshness of food. When we go to the supermarket, that food is old. That food is at least a week old almost. Came from California somewhere, it was picked and it's thrown in bins, and then it was thrown on trucks, and then it came in and it went to a distribution system like Cisco, and then that they distribute it to the supermarkets, and then someone puts it on the shelf, and it's a week old by the time you eat that. It has only half the nutrients that it did when it was. So we're all eating expensive food from the point of view of what nutrition do you get out of it per weight or whatever that you're measuring. So by bringing the food, so the future food is more vertical, less horizontal, more closer to cities and less rural. So that's just it scales better if you're going to do something. If you put a bioreactor, it's going to scale in a city much better in the rural area, right? So you're just going to see this movement and shift and using rooftops and other places inside cities to grow things. I know Paris is working really hard on trying to green. It is already has the second most trees per capita than any other city, but they're trying to also incorporate these ideas of growing food inside the city on the sides of walls and things like that. So the general movement.
I really appreciate that style of architecture when I see a lot of green, even like when I'm walking past the house and it's covered in ivy. I think that's so beautiful. And I think that speaks something like deeply within us, right? Like we're at the end of the day, animals, and we're moving more and more to city life, and the green spaces from my perspective have been medically proven to make us healthier. They decrease blood pressure. They make us less anxious. And so it is something that I look forward to see vertical farms and just more green space in general in cities, because whether we like it or not, that's the way that our society is trending, right? Like we're all moving to cities. These cities are becoming larger and larger. And how do we sustain them with the rapid increase in population, right? Yeah. I really like Denver a lot. I think it's got a really cool community. Is there a big futurist community over there, or is it
somewhat?
Yeah.
It's not because we have decent universities here. Certainly CU does a lot of pretty good research, and of course we have another school in mining. School of Mines is pretty top notch as far as that side of the world. But it's it's not Boston. It's not San Francisco, but it is a trendsetter city. So like ski apparel, or what's a cool thing. It's in the top 5 or so U.S. cities as far as setting trends.
I could see that. Yeah. No, every time I go out there, it's really, really fun and really nice experience. The people are so nice, just like yourself. Have you been out to any other of these futurist conferences? Like what are you going to that really sparks your own interest in this kind of stuff?
Well, I actually don't think a whole lot about all my other futurist friends. Some of them I do, but a lot. There's segments of futurists who I just don't relate to. So there's those who are how they wish the world would be, and it totally ignores kind of, I think, greed and selfishness and vested interests and all the things that it's sort of idealistic. right? And that's just not the way. It's got to make money. It's got, people aren't just going to eat plants because they should eat plants.
Right.
So there's a lot of futurists who do that. Then there's the industry itself. I call it an industry. It was originally tainted by a particular way of thinking about the future that most futurists still use, or at least have. And I think it's almost junk, which is the idea of scenario planning. So scenario planning came from the RAND Corporation about the idea. It was hired by the US government. What happens if there's an atomic attack from Russia? And they created scenarios. But they took that from Hollywood. So they came up with this idea, Hollywood, when they're working on scripts, they think of different endings to their thing. So we'll use the same idea, and we'll do different endings to end games with a nuclear attack. And then we'll think about, how do you evacuate a city? If you got 20 minutes, what would happen in this scenario? And then they kind of created a structure to that. So like worst case, best case, most likely case. Now that's good for disasters. If there's a volcano, if there's a war, if there's, some break in the supply chain. So it does have its value, but it doesn't relate to technology. Technology doesn't have worst case, best case, most likely case. It just is. Technology starts in R&D. If it's good enough, people will invest in it to commercialize it, and then it gets adopted. And if it's got to be faster, better, cheaper in some respects. And it's very predictable. Technology, if you look in technology, you see what's going on in R&D and you go, wow, that's amazing. That's better than what we have. It's a good chance that eventually will commercialize and be adopted. And so it's pretty predictable. It's not like worst case, best case. It's not. It's just like, and I have developed an approach to evaluating it. Where is it on a scale? This is a scale. How novel is it? How useful is it? Et cetera, et cetera. So I have a criteria which I judge, and I can see tipping points. It's like, well, the problem is this isn't safe. So this technology is cool, but it's not as safe as what's out there, or whatever, or reliable. It's whatever. And you can come up with new battery technology, but one of the things that happens with batteries is, but you can't charge it 10,000 times. So it's not going to make it from the market point of view. So I use my kind of more business thinking when I'm thinking about what's going to make it. And then and then I'm watching for those tipping points happening. And then I see someone comes like, I've just dropped the cost or the way to do it, or the production or the scale to the point where it's going to go, this will go. Now, there's plenty of money out there. There's just so much money to invest in stuff. We don't have a shortage of money. What we've had up to this point is the speed in which the R&D happens was really slow. And I think with the advent of, adding AI, having an explosion in new materials, explosion in biology, explosion in physics, that creates new discoveries, and new discoveries lead to new inventions and new ways of doing things. And we've never been aware of this before, because really the lab stuff is not much different than when Mendel was doing it or Thomas Edison was doing labs up until recently. But when you add AI, and now, like, for example, go back to proteins where we started. So now you can ask an AI, I need a protein that does this. I need a molecular robot that will create this material for me. You combine these to make this molecule. And it either tells me, one of your existing 2 million proteins will do that for you. Or it says, try these ideas. And it'll give you 20 different options of a new protein that doesn't exist in nature that might work. And then a human can go look at those 20 and say, well, only 5 of those are practical. And then they now focus on 5. Now you compare that to what it used to take. If you said, I want to come up with a protein that does X, you would have had to experiment for years to try to figure that out. So that is going accelerated crazy. So the recent history has been acceleration of adoption. Now we got acceleration of science and discovery and invention. And that's just starting, but it's going to come in a big wave and just completely change how fast things evolve.
Yeah. Wow. I would love to talk to you longer, but we're getting towards the end of our time. Okay. And so at the end of every segment, I'd like to ask somebody 3 questions, because as you're talking, like, my mind is going like crazy. I'm like, I want to ask him about this. I want to ask him about this. But yeah, really great talk. I feel like my mind was blown multiple times, especially with that last bit. that we had just talked about the exponential growth that we're about to get into with AI. So first off, quick question. You talked a little bit about tipping points. Do you see that tipping point happening in food right now, or are we a ways away from that?
I think with the meats and the growing of proteins, we really have reached the tipping point. The price is there, the scale is there. It's not going to go like crazy, but it's definitely not. It's unstoppable. Let's put it. It's inevitable, unstoppable. You can pass all the laws you want, whatever. You're not going to be able to stop it because it's worldwide. Just when you see something pop up all around the world with startups doing the same basic idea, it's unstoppable. So I think with the meat side, that's there. I think vertical farming with Netherlands, the fact that they are really kind of on it and they've been successful, commercially successful with it. And they're just pushing so fast at increasing yields. And the way they're doing it, as you say, is without pesticides, without herbicides. That's cool. And then they're making money. And it's sustainable that way. You're going to get resistance in places like the United States. I mean, let's face it, farming the way it's done in the United States, but done the way it's been done. And it runs, it has a lot of political power.
Yeah.
And the chemistry industry is so involved that the chemical industry runs farming as well. So expect resistance.
Right.
Yeah.
So, wow, interesting. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about specifically with this kind of stuff is when you wanted to get into futurism, like when you're seeing all this stuff, like as a budding person in this kind of field myself, like what can I do to learn more about not only food, but just the stuff that's coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, there's kind of a heavy lifting part of being a futurist, which is reading and research. But I actually saw something. The World Economic Forum has created an AI that curates based on 300 different technologies. It's not too expensive. I forgot what it is. About $100, no, $1,000 a year. So I'm probably going to pony up, see how good it is. But that makes a lot of sense. ChatGPT can learn 3.5 million times faster than a human. So being able to read articles and then kind of get the gist of it. Now, how good is it at filtering out promotion versus, real? I don't know. Maybe, it's just peer reviews or whatever. But that's kind of cool. But for the average person, is it worth to spend $1,000? I don't know. But that's what I do. I get lists that are already curated for me. So so if you poke around, you can find Singularity does some, there's various, they all have their own biases. So I try to get stuff from Science Digest, et cetera. And I read through them every day. I'm mostly just reading the headlines and the summaries. And then if it's like something I never heard of before or perks my interest, I dig in on that one. And then just over time, I've been doing this for 15 years. So so I have a pretty big base in my head of what's new and what's not new, or what's a slight advantage. So I'm looking for those tipping points more than the average person you would be overwhelmed by reading all of these science articles. And I do say, what, I'm not going to read the science, space stuff. I mean, I'll glance at it, but I do not. I chose to say it is exploding, the physics, understanding of the physics of the universe, but it doesn't affect, there's not a client out there who's paying me to tell them about the physics of the universe, and nor do I understand everything about quantum computing, et cetera. So I sort of stay away from that, but I'm focused on things that are pragmatic that we do every day, food and production and manufacturing and digital spaces and things like that.
That's cool. So last question, I ask all my guests this, but what personally gets me excited about the future is the present science fiction that is being written, even in the past. Like I always tell people, like my idea of a utopia was really influenced a lot by Star Trek, right? And my idea of robots was influenced a lot by Asimov. My idea of artificial intelligence was influenced a lot by the cyberpunk genre. So what is it in regards to fiction and even science fiction that you really has produced a lot of influence on your life?
Well, it's certainly Star Trek is amazing how it did a good job of predicting. Like the holograph is coming. That's what's wild. Things like that.
Yeah.
I loved science fiction, the typical science fiction. And I'm a little older than you, so I grew up on the black and white, aliens coming and what does that mean? And they weren't all horror. I mean, I'm trying to think the day the world stood still is one where a robot comes and satellite lands in Washington, D.C., and its mission is to stop war. So it's basically these other societies in the universe have agreed to have this policeman that prevents war from happening on their planets. And he's coming to make that proposal for us, that he can have this system that just will stop us from killing one another. I don't know, just the concept, that's a pretty interesting concept.
Yeah, no, I'm certainly optimistic, which I really appreciate. I think that's really the take home message from today's talk is I'm really optimistic about all those things that you've talked about. And I can't wait to try some of these restaurants that I'm going to do my own research and I'll report back. I'll let you know.
Well, you should check out MIT, as they say, they're doing a lot with playing with these things as well. So maybe there's some way to.
Absolutely. I live just a few blocks from MIT, so I'm going to go ahead and do my research and try to reach out. But anyway, thank you so much, Michael, for speaking with us today. For those of you who are listening, it was great having you, and I will look forward to seeing you guys in the future. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you. Terrific.
We appreciate you taking part in today's episode. Take this chance to reimagine a better future by joining a community of futurists who strive for a remarkable world. Be a part of this growing network and contribute to making the world a more positive place. Visit thefuturistsociety.net and subscribe to the show so you don't miss a drop of hopeful futurism.